The resort manager laughed when she set the jar of honey on his polished front desk. Not a cruel laugh, the kind busy men give when they don't have time to be cruel, only dismissive. "We have a 5-star kitchen, ma'am," he said, sliding it back toward her. "We don't need a farm stand." 3 weeks later, that same honey would be the most requested item on his breakfast menu, and he still wouldn't know her name. Rain had been falling on Marlene Tuck's farm for 2 days straight, the kind of slow Ohio rain that soaked into everything and made the gravel road to her porch turn the color of wet clay. She didn't know yet that the biggest hotel ever built in the county was about to change her life. She just knew her bees were getting restless and her knees were getting old. Marlene Tuck was 61 years old, a widow for the last 9 of those years, and she had farmed 11 acres outside of Carroll County since she was 23. The land had come from her husband Walt's family, not handed down so much as fought for, paid off slowly with a Massey Ferguson tractor that was older than their marriage and a mortgage from Continental Trust Bank that took 18 years to clear. Walt had died of a heart attack in the soybean field in early spring, the kind of death farmers talked about in hushed voices because it could happen to any of them, any day, with no warning at all. After he passed, most of the neighbors expected Marlene to sell. 11 acres wasn't enough for row crops to matter, not in an era of 1,000-acre operations and grain elevators that barely blinked at anything under 500 bushels. But Marlene didn't grow corn or soybeans anymore. She kept bees, 42 hives, scattered in 3 clusters across the property, tucked behind windbreaks of black walnut trees that Walt had planted the year they got married. She made honey, yes, but also beeswax candles, lip balms, and a tart blackberry preserve from the wild brambles that grew along the fence line nobody else wanted to deal with. She sold these at the Carroll County Farmers Market every Saturday from a folding table with a hand-painted sign that said Tuck Farm, Honest Honey. She kept records of everything in a green spiral notebook that lived in the pocket of her barn coat. Temperatures, rainfall, which hives were strong, which queens needed replacing. It was a habit from Walt, who used to say that land tells you everything if you're willing to write it down and shut up long enough to listen. The land around Carroll County had been quiet for decades, quiet enough that nobody much noticed when survey trucks started showing up on the old Pemberton property 2 miles down the county road. Then the bulldozers came, then the cranes. By the following spring, a company called Halloway Hospitality Group had broken ground on what local newspapers were calling the largest resort development in the region's history. 210 rooms, a spa, 3 restaurants, and a golf course laid over what used to be cattle pasture. Marlene didn't think much of it at first. Resorts didn't need beekeepers. She figured the wealthy guests who'd be staying there wanted infinity pools and steak dinners, not jars of honey from a widow's porch. She kept tending her hives, kept writing in her notebook, kept showing up to the Saturday market like she always had. The trouble started small, the way most rural trouble does, not with shouting, but with paperwork. A county zoning notice arrived in Marlene's mailbox in April, informing her that the new resort's buffer zone regulations required all agricultural operations with insect colonies within a half-mile radius to file for a special use permit. The fee was $450. The form was 11 pages long. She drove into town to ask about it and ended up in the office of a county planning official named Russell Combs, a man in his 30s who'd been hired specifically to handle resort-related development issues. He had a binder on his desk 3 inches thick, and he barely looked up from it. "It's a liability thing," Russell said. "Resort guests, you understand. Bee stings, allergic reactions." Halloway's legal team flagged it during the environmental review. He tapped a clause on a printed page without turning it toward her. 42 hives is a lot of insects that close to a luxury property, Mrs. Tuck. We're not saying shut it down. We're saying it needs to be managed. Marlene asked what managed meant exactly. Russell shrugged in the particular way of a man who had 15 more meetings that day and genuinely did not have the bandwidth to care. Could mean relocating some hives. Could mean nothing if you get the permit. I wouldn't worry about it too much. He said it kindly enough. He wasn't a villain. He was simply a man with a stack of paperwork and a resort opening date that the county commissioners had pinned a ribbon-cutting ceremony to, and an old woman's bees were a footnote in a 400-page environmental impact report nobody had fully read. She left his office with the permit application in her purse and a strange, settling unease in her chest. Not panic, not yet, just the quiet recognition that something built far bigger than her was now standing close enough to cast a shadow over everything she'd spent 38 years building. She didn't argue with Russell. She didn't write an angry letter to the county commissioners, the way her neighbor Dale Hutchins did, the one who lost his hog operation to a similar zoning fight 2 counties over. Marlene just went home, fed her hives, and opened her green notebook to a fresh page. She started writing things down differently after that. Not just temperatures and queen activity anymore. Distances, flight patterns, foraging radius. She'd read once, years ago, in a beekeeping bulletin Walt used to get in the mail, that honeybees typically foraged within a 2-mile radius of their hive, sometimes farther depending on what was blooming. She wanted numbers. Numbers were the only language that men like Russell Combs seemed to respect. For 3 weeks, Marlene walked her property every morning before sunrise, a thermos of coffee in one hand and the green notebook in the other. She measured the distance from her hive clusters to the resort's nearest structure with a 100-foot tape measure and a long roll of orange surveyor's twine she bought at the hardware store for $6. The closest hive cluster sat 840 feet from the resort's planned pool deck. Not the half-mile the zoning notice implied was standard, but still close enough that a careless person could wander into a forager's path. The first thing she noticed, and wrote down on a Tuesday morning in May, was that her bees weren't actually drawn to the resort property at all. The cleared land around the construction site had been stripped of clover and wildflower growth months earlier for grading work. There was nothing there for a bee to want. Her foragers were going the opposite direction entirely, toward the 11 acres of overgrown fence line and the neighboring Pemberton orchard that hadn't been touched by bulldozers. The second thing she discovered came 2 weeks later, when she started tracking which flowers her bees actually visited using a simple method Walt had taught her, dabbing a tiny bit of food coloring on returning foragers and watching where the colored bees reappeared. She logged it carefully. Clover, black locust, the wild blackberry along the southern fence, and, to her surprise, the ornamental flowering shrubs the resort's landscaping crew had just planted along its new entrance drive, nearly a third a mile from the hives, but planted in dense, blooming clusters that practically advertised themselves to a forager's eye. If anything, her bees were pollinating the resort's own landscaping for free. The third discovery was the one that mattered most, and it came almost by accident. In early June, Marlene drove to the Halloway construction site to drop off a permit-related document Russell had asked for, and she ended up waiting nearly 40 minutes in a hallway near the kitchen offices while a delivery dispute was sorted out. She overheard 2 chefs arguing about a supplier who'd failed to deliver local honey for the breakfast program, a key marketing point for the resort's farm-to-table branding that Halloway's corporate office had specifically requested. The supplier, it turned out, was sourcing honey from 3 states away and reselling it at a markup, calling it regional on the label. Marlene wrote the date and the overheard conversation in her notebook that night, underlining one phrase twice. They want local. They just don't know where to look. She didn't say anything to anyone. She filed her permit application, paid her $450, and kept measuring, kept walking, kept writing. By midsummer, the resort's opening date was 8 weeks out, and the pressure on Caro County small landowners had only grown. Russell Combs sent a second notice to Marlene in July, this one less polite, a follow-up inspection request, citing guest safety priorities ahead of the August 14th grand opening. He wanted to walk her property personally, accompanied by someone from Halloway's risk management team. Marlene agreed to the inspection without protest, which seemed to surprise Russell more than anything else she'd done. He arrived on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and a younger Halloway representative named Priya Anand, who wore resort-branded khakis and carried a laptop bag that looked entirely wrong for walking through grass. They measured the same distances Marlene had already measured weeks earlier. They asked the same questions about allergic reactions and liability that Russell had asked back in his office. At one point, Priya remarked, not unkindly, but with the breezy confidence of someone reciting a corporate talking point, that from a brand perspective, we just can't have anything that disrupts the guest experience. Marlene didn't argue. She simply opened her green notebook and showed them the flight pattern data, the food coloring tracking, the distances, the fact that her foragers spent most of their time heading away from the resort, not toward it. Russell flipped through a few pages, polite but unconvinced. This is good information, Mrs. Tuck, but it's anecdotal. We need something more official. Priya nodded along. Neither of them asked to keep a copy. What nobody at Halloway seemed to fully grasp yet was that their own landscaping plan, 600 newly planted flowering shrubs along the entrance drive, plus a planned herb garden for the spa's aromatherapy treatments, was about to bloom in spectacular volume in the exact weeks of the grand opening. Marlene had already logged, in careful pencil, that those shrubs were a documented forage source for her colonies. The resort had unknowingly built an enormous, fragrant welcome mat for the very bees they were trying to regulate away. Meanwhile, the supplier problem Marlene had overheard in the kitchen hallway hadn't gone away. It had gotten worse. The out-of-state honey distributor missed a second shipment in late July, and the head chef, a man named Desmond Ferris who had been hired away from a hotel chain in Chicago and was under enormous pressure to deliver a flawless opening menu, was reportedly furious, threatening to pull the regional honey item from the breakfast program entirely rather than risk an empty serving dish on opening day. Word moved slowly but surely through small counties, and Marlene's cousin, who cleaned rooms part-time during the resort's pre-opening staffing rush, mentioned the chef's frustration to her one evening almost in passing. Marlene wrote it down. She didn't call the resort. She didn't offer anything. She simply kept her bees fed, kept her notebook full, and waited the way she'd learned to wait through 40 winters on that land, patiently, without drama, trusting that truth on a farm has its own timeline, and rushing it rarely helps. The county held its final pre-opening compliance meeting on the first Monday of August, in a conference room at the Caro County Administrative Building, with Russell Combs, 2 Halloway representatives, a county health inspector, and Marlene Tuck seated around a long table with bad fluorescent lighting. The purpose of the meeting was simple: determine whether Marlene's 42 hives required relocation before the resort's August 14th opening. A move that Russell's office had floated could cost her an estimated $6,000 in equipment, hive transport, and lost honey production for the season. A number Marlene had written at the top of her notebook the day she first heard it, circled twice. Marlene brought her green notebook, now nearly full, and laid it open on the table without a word. She walked them through the food coloring forager study, the 840-foot distance measurement, and the documented fact, confirmed by her own observation logs spanning 11 weeks, that her bees foraged predominantly away from the resort property, not toward it, with one notable exception. That exception was the resort's own landscaping. She slid a single typed page across the table, something she'd asked her granddaughter to help format on a library computer the week before. It listed every flowering plant species in the resort's new entrance garden and herb beds, cross-referenced against her forager tracking data. The bees weren't a threat to the resort. They were, by simple botanical fact, going to be pollinating Halloway's own 600 shrubs, whether anyone gave them permission or not. There was a long pause. Russell looked at Priya. Priya looked at the health inspector, who had been quietly nodding through Marlene's explanation, and finally spoke up to confirm that nothing in the report suggested any genuine safety concern beyond standard, common-sense precautions any property near agricultural land would already follow. Then Marlene mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she understood the kitchen had been having supplier trouble with their honey program. She didn't frame it as an offer. She simply said it was a shame, because 42 hives produced more honey than the Caro County Farmers Market alone could use, and she'd always wondered what local honey might taste like on a hotel breakfast table. The room went quiet. Not an awkward silence, a thinking one. Russell closed his binder slowly. Nobody had expected the bee problem and the supplier problem to be the same conversation. 3 weeks after the resort's grand opening, Marlene Tuck signed a modest supply agreement with Halloway Hospitality Group. 12 cases of honey jars a month, plus beeswax candles for guest rooms, at a price that worked out to just under $900 monthly. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady, and it was honest, and the relocation cost that had been hanging over her, that projected $6,000, never materialized at all. The permit, in the end, was approved without a single hive moved an inch. The story didn't spread through Caro County in any dramatic way. There was no newspaper headline, no triumphant town hall announcement. It moved the way most true things move in farming country, slowly, through conversations at the feed store, through someone's cousin who cleaned rooms, through a line item on a resort menu that simply read local wildflower honey, Tuck Farm, without much fanfare at all. Guests at the resort began asking the front desk where they could buy a jar to take home. The same manager who had once slid Marlene's honey jar back across his desk now kept a small case of them near the gift shop register, restocked weekly. He never apologized, not in so many words. He didn't need to. Marlene wasn't the type to expect one. Russell Combs still worked for the county. He still had stacks of paperwork on his desk and 15 meetings a day. But the next time a small landowner near a development project filed a complaint, people say he asked for measurements before he asked for a permit fee. Whether that was kindness or simply caution, nobody could say for certain, and Marlene never brought it up either way. She didn't tell the story much herself. When her granddaughter asked her about it that fall, helping fill jars at the kitchen table, Marlene mostly talked about the bees, how the colonies had done well that season, how the resort's landscaping had turned out to be good forage after all, how Walt would have found the whole thing funny in his quiet way, a 5-star resort getting outmaneuvered by a woman with a tape measure and a spiral notebook. She didn't call it winning. She called it paying attention. Life on the farm continued the way it always had. The hives needed checking in spring. The honey needed extracting in late summer. The notebook filled up and a new one started, the way it always did, full of numbers nobody else would ever read but her. If you're watching this from a small town where everybody seems to know everybody's business, hit subscribe. Stories like Marlene's are still happening out there, quietly, in places most people drive past without a second look. If you've ever felt dismissed by someone with a bigger desk and a thicker binder than you, you already know exactly why this story matters. There are more like it coming. You want to be here for them. There's a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from staying in one place long enough to watch it change. Marlene Tuck never set out to prove anyone wrong. She set out to write down what was true, morning after morning, in pencil, in a notebook that fit in a barn coat pocket, because that was what the land had taught her to do. The resort still stands 2 miles down the county road, its pool deck busy most weekends, its golf course mowed in tidy stripes. The flowering shrubs along its entrance drive still bloom every summer, and somewhere in that bloom, Tuck Farm bees still do the same quiet work they've always done, indifferent to zoning maps and liability clauses and grand opening ribbons.